October 16th, 1962, 8:45 a.m. From the outside, it looked like any other pretty morning in Washington. Tourists snapped photos at the White House fence. School kids shouted on playgrounds. A milk truck rattled down Pennsylvania Avenue. Somewhere a radio played rock and roll. Inside the West Wing, a young president held in his hands the closest thing to the end of the world anyone had ever seen on paper. John F. Kennedy sat at a small table in the cabinet room, a stack of black and white photographs in front of him. He wore a dark suit, hair perfectly parted, the picture of calm. His right thumb would not stop pressing into the edge of the top photo. The CIA briefer leaned over him, a thin pointer in his hand. "These are U-2 reconnaissance photos taken Sunday, Mr. President," he said. "San Cristobal area, western Cuba." He tapped the glossy print. Long cylinders on launchers, trucks, freshly poured concrete pads, camouflage nets draped badly over shapes that wanted to be hidden and failed. "These," the briefer said, "are SS-4 Sandal medium-range ballistic missiles. Range, approximately 1,100 miles. Estimated flight time to Washington." He hesitated, as if the number itself were obscene. "About 13 minutes. Kennedy's thumb stopped moving. 13 minutes. He thought of it the way a sailor thinks of distance to shore. 13 minutes between a normal day and the sky turning into a second sun over his own capital. 13 minutes between his children eating breakfast and their shadows being burned into the wall. "How long until they're operational?" he asked. "Within 2 weeks, sir. Maybe less." The room was full. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, a scattering of National Security Council staff, and at the far side of the table, in a row of uniforms, heavy with ribbons and stars, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Curtis LeMay sat in the middle of them like a block of stone. LeMay had a face like a clenched fist and a cigar parked in one corner of his mouth. Thick wrists, thick fingers. He looked more like a bulldozer in human form than a man. This was the architect of the firebombing of Tokyo, the man who had watched entire cities turn into burning grids from 30,000 feet up and called it a necessary night's work. He looked at the same photographs and did not blink. Kennedy set the pictures down. He was 45. His back hurt so much some mornings he needed help just putting on his shoes. He had commanded a PT boat in the Pacific and almost died when a Japanese destroyer cut it in half. He knew what it looked like when metal and flesh met at high speed. He also knew what those first atomic bombs had done. He had watched the films, the mushroom cloud, the way the light erased everything, the burned shadows on concrete. And now, the man who had dropped those bombs' cousins in conventional form was staring at new weapons pointing at his country's heart. LeMay leaned forward, massive hands folded. "Mr. President," he said, voice flat and confident, "there's only one way to handle this. We go in. Fast. We take out every missile site with an airstrike. Then, if necessary, we invade. We wipe Castro off the map. We cannot sit around and let the Russians park nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida." To LeMay, it was easy. The Soviets had cheated. They had put a gun to America's head. You don't argue with a man holding a gun to your temple. You knock his teeth out. Kennedy heard him. But behind LeMay's words, he heard a different sound. The roar of surf at a place called the Bay of Pigs. A year and a half earlier, in April 1961, he'd sat in a similar room and listened to other confident men in uniforms and dark suits. They had promised him that a small invasion force of Cuban exiles, backed by the CIA, could spark an uprising against Fidel Castro. No need for American troops, no messy headlines, just a quick, clean win. They had asked for his signature. He had given it. He remembered the feeling when it all fell apart. The reports of men trapped on the beach. The photographs splashed across newspapers. His name tied to a fiasco everyone pretended had been inevitable, until the moment it happened, when it suddenly became his fault alone. In private, he had told friends that he would never again be bullied or jammed by his own advisors into a decision that stank in his gut. Now, Curtis LeMay was sitting in front of him, selling a different kind of quick, clean win. Kennedy picked the top photo back up and stared at the long, slender shapes. "Do we know how many?" he asked. "Several sites under construction, sir," the briefer replied. "We expect more. Some may already be hidden." McNamara spoke, voice smooth but tense. "Mr. President, we're looking at two main options: immediate airstrikes against all known missile sites, likely followed by an invasion, or a naval quarantine around Cuba to prevent further offensive weapons from arriving, combined with diplomatic pressure." LeMay let out a small, audible snort. "Quarantine," he repeated, making the word sound like an insult. "That's a blockade by another name. It's an act of war anyway. We might as well fight a war we intend to win." He tapped the table with a thick finger. "We have overwhelming air superiority. We hit those sites before they're operational, Mr. President, and this whole problem goes away. One sharp blow." Kennedy looked at him. LeMay's eyes were calm. He had destroyed more cities than anyone else in the room. He had watched crews come back without planes behind them. He wasn't bluffing. He really believed what he was saying. That was what made it dangerous. Kennedy set the photos down again and folded his hands. "Let's get all the options," he said. "I want to hear every view." LeMay's jaw tightened a fraction. To him, every view sounded like weakness. They formed EXCOMM, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For the next 13 days, they would sit around that table, morning and night, and argue about how close they were willing to get to annihilation in order not to look afraid. From the first meeting, the lines were clear. On one side, the strikers, LeMay, the rest of the Joint Chiefs. Dean Acheson, elder statesman who had helped build the post-war order and was now quite prepared to test if it could survive a nuclear spasm. On the other side, the blockaders. Kennedy, his brother Bobby, McNamara, men who wanted to put a ring of steel around Cuba. American warships stopping and searching Soviet vessels, to buy time and force Khrushchev to back down without anyone firing first. The arguments were not polite debates. They were knife fights under fluorescent light. In one early session, the generals repeated their case. "Mr. President," the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, "a surprise airstrike is the surest way to remove these missiles before they become operational. We can take them out with minimal warning and minimal casualties." "Minimal?" Bobby Kennedy shot back. "To whom? The pilots? The Cubans on the ground? The Russians manning those sites?" "It's war," LeMay said, as if explaining gravity to a child. "War is dangerous, but leaving those missiles there is suicide." He leaned forward, cigar smoke washing across the table. "You know what this blockade looks like, Mr. President," he said. "It looks like appeasement. It looks like Munich all over again." The word hit the room like a slap. Munich. In the code book of the 20th century, That was the ultimate insult. That was Chamberlain stepping off an airplane, waving a piece of paper with Hitler's signature on it, promising peace in our time, while the tanks were already warming their engines. LeMay hadn't just questioned the policy. He had called the president weak. In the one word no Western leader ever wanted to hear next to his name. The room held its breath. Kennedy's face went still. He didn't raise his voice. "General," he said slowly, "what you're proposing is a surprise attack on a smaller country that is not fired on us. The world has a word for that too." He let it hang. Pearl Harbor. He didn't have to say it. LeMay did not back down. "Mr. President, the difference is we're not the aggressors here," he said. "The Soviets put those missiles there. They've already committed the hostile act. We're just cleaning up." Robert Kennedy's chair scraped back a fraction. "Cleaning up," he repeated. "You're talking about bombing without warning, killing Russians and Cubans in their beds, and you think no one's going to notice the difference?" LeMay turned his head and looked right at the Attorney General. "I'm talking about doing what we have to do before the Russians think we've gone soft," he said. "Our allies are watching. If we accept these missiles and hide behind a blockade, we're going to look scared." Kennedy watched the exchange with a tight jaw. He had been mocked for his youth since he took office, for his Ivy League accent, for his back brace. But this was different. This was his own top general comparing him, with that one word, Munich, to the most infamous failure of nerve in modern history. He felt a flush of anger under the ribs. LeMay saw it and pushed anyway. "From where I sit," he said, "this course of action," he nodded toward the naval charts, "is almost as bad as appeasement. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." The silence after that was total. Kennedy stared at him. "You're in there with me," he said, voice suddenly sharp. For the first time, LeMay blinked. The line had slipped. For all his talk, if this went wrong and the missiles flew, it wouldn't just be a young president's mistake. It would be the general's war, too. But even that didn't fully register for him. LeMay still thought in World War II terms. Surprise was a tool, not a sin. Cities were targets, not graveyards full of names. Nuclear weapons were just bigger bombs. Kennedy was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about the absence of a world. Outside the cabinet room, life in America carried on. Kennedy went to public events. He smiled for cameras. He shook hands. At one reception, a voter told him she prayed for him every night. He said, "Thank you," and tried not to think about what, precisely, he needed those prayers for this week. He ate dinner with his family, kissed his infant son goodnight, and walked out of the nursery knowing, and not saying, that there were Soviet missiles on an island 90 miles away that could erase that tiny sleeping body in less than a quarter of an hour. In the private residence late one night, he sat with Bobby. "They think you're weak, you know," Bobby said, not sugarcoating it. "I know they do," Jack answered. "They think you're afraid to use force." Kennedy turned on him sharply. "I am afraid," he snapped. "Anybody who isn't in this situation is out of his mind." He paced, one hand on his lower back. "These guys," he said, "they talk like this is another bombing campaign. Tokyo, Dresden, take your pick. They think there's such a thing as a limited nuclear war. There isn't. Once we start, we don't know where it stops. They think in terms of winning. I'm thinking in terms of whether there's anything left to win." He stopped and looked at his brother. "They can go back to their bases if they're wrong," he said quietly. "I don't get to go anywhere. My name is on this. If we miscalculate, Bobby, it's not my presidency that ends. It's everything. Bobby nodded slowly. Then you can't let them drag you into a war they think they understand, and you know they don't, he said. Kennedy exhaled. That's exactly what they're trying to do. On October 22nd, after 6 days of secret, furious argument, Kennedy went on television. He sat behind a desk in the Oval Office, the seal of the president on the wall behind him, eyes scanning the words one more time as the cameras warmed. He looked composed. He felt like a man about to tell 200 million people that he had found a bomb under their house and was now going to try to disarm it in the dark. My fellow citizens, he began, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. He laid out, in calm sentences, what the U-2 photographs had revealed. Soviet offensive missiles, their range, their purpose. There was no theatrical language, just facts. Then he announced the response: a naval quarantine of Cuba. No offensive weapons would be allowed to reach the island. Any vessel carrying such weapons would be turned back. He demanded the dismantling and removal of the missiles already there. And then came the line that changed the air in every living room in America. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, he said, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. In the Pentagon, LeMay listened. To the public, the speech sounded tough. To allies, it sounded determined. To LeMay, it still sounded like half a step. No airstrikes, no invasion. A ring of ships and words. He stubbed out his cigar and said, in private, what he really thought. It's the greatest defeat in our history, he groused to colleagues. We had them, and we didn't take the shot. He could not see the invisible thing Kennedy was trying to protect. It wasn't credibility. It wasn't even just cities. It was the last line between anger and annihilation, the refusal to strike first. In the days after the speech, American destroyers and cruisers fanned out across the Atlantic, taking up positions along the quarantine line. Soviet ships steamed toward them, carrying unknown cargoes. In EXCOMM, the charts filled up with pins. Gagarin is here. Grozny is here, an officer would report, pointing at tiny symbols. We'll intercept them at these points. Each move was a test. Would a Soviet captain obey orders to turn around? Would an American captain fire if he didn't? Would a jittery pilot, flying low over a freighter, misread a flash of light and shoot? Every day, the missiles in Cuba grew closer to full readiness. And every day, LeMay and the strikers repeated their mantra. We're losing the advantage, they warned. Once those missiles are operational, we can't be sure of taking them all out. We're sitting here waiting while the noose tightens. At one meeting, LeMay's frustration boiled over into near open contempt again. Mr. President, he said, this blockade and political action, I see it as leading right into war. He sounded genuinely incredulous. This is your best course to avoid war? Kennedy looked at him. Yes, he said, with a little more steel this time. This is precisely the course to avoid war. It sounded insane to the general. How could doing less now lead to less later? But Kennedy wasn't playing for advantage. He was playing for not blowing up half the human race by Tuesday. He knew something his generals refused to say out loud. If he gave the order to bomb those sites and one Soviet officer somewhere in Cuba, or in a submarine, or at a radar screen, decided he was under full attack and responded, there would be no such thing as limited war anymore. There would be only war, period. And the people who would burn first would not be sitting around the cabinet room table. They would be in cities, holding their kids. The most dangerous person in that crisis was not the cartoon villain in the Kremlin or the wild-eyed revolutionary in Havana. It was the respectable man in the crisp uniform with the chest full of medals who looked the president in the eye and said, "Trust me, I've won wars. I know how this goes." Kennedy had trusted that tone at the Bay of Pigs and been humiliated. Now that same tone was telling him that the way to prove his courage was to start a chain reaction he might not be able to stop. He listened, he nodded, and, for the second time in his presidency, he quietly decided not to do what his own generals told him a real man would do. To Curtis LeMay, that felt like betrayal. The commander-in-chief had asked for his expert judgment. He had given it, shaped by a career of destroying enemies from the air and calling it victory. And the Harvard boy behind the desk had rejected it as too dangerous, too reckless, too blind. But this wasn't 1945 anymore. This was the nuclear age. In World War II, the worst that could happen if you were wrong was that more cities died than you meant to kill. In 1962, if you were wrong, there might not be enough people left to argue about who was to blame. That was the real battle in those first days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not just Washington versus Moscow, but a young president versus his own war heroes, men who had grown so used to winning by hitting first and hardest they could not see that, for the first time in history, the greatest act of strength might be not hitting at all. October 24th, 1962, 2 days after the speech. On the maps in the Situation Room, the world was reduced to thin blue lines and tiny ship symbols inching toward each other across the Atlantic. American destroyers and cruisers formed an invisible fence around Cuba, the quarantine line. Beyond it, Soviet freighters and tankers plowed through gray water, bows pointed straight at that fence. In the low-lit room, the air felt stale. Men had been breathing the same fear in and out for hours. "Gagarin, here," an officer said, pointing. "Grozny, here. Estimated time to intercept, 3 hours." Every time he spoke, it was like announcing how long was left on a fuse. Kennedy sat at the end of the table, jacket off now, tie loosened, eyes on the chart. He looked calm. His stomach was tight enough to bend steel. "Any sign they're slowing?" he asked. "Negative so far, sir." If a Soviet captain decided not to turn around, a young American captain in a destroyer would have to decide whether to fire a warning shot. If that spiraled into an exchange, it could become, in the chain of command's dry language, hostilities. The wall between peace and war that people used to imagine as a thick brick barrier had, over the last days, revealed itself as a thin line on a map, drawn by men in pencil, and erased by men in pencil. The chief sat along one side of the table, shoulders rigid. LeMay watched the symbols creep closer with undisguised impatience. "This is ridiculous," he muttered at one point to the general next to him, not quite softly enough. "We're begging them to call our bluff. We could knock these ships and those missiles out in an afternoon." Kennedy heard that tone and forced himself not to react. Minutes dragged. Then, as the first Soviet ships neared the line, reports changed. "Mr. President, we have new signals," the officer said. "The Gagarin has slowed. Grozny appears to have stopped. Other ships altering course, possibly turning back." The relief in the room was immediate and physical. You could feel men breathe again. Kennedy didn't exhale. He knew what it meant. Someone in Moscow had flinched. But missiles were still in Cuba. Construction still continued on launch sites. The gun was still at America's head. It had just stopped moving closer. "We're not out of this," he said quietly. "We've just avoided the stupidest way to start a war." LeMay's expression barely shifted. To him, turning the ships back meant one thing. The blockade had worked, yes, but it had also wasted the chance for a clean, decisive strike. Now the Russians would dig in. Now the missiles on Cuba would only get harder to take out. In his gut, he believed history would say, "That was the moment we should have hit them. We blinked." To Kennedy, blinking was called not killing everyone. They were not living in the same world. October 27th, later called Black Saturday. The day started badly and got worse. In the morning, intelligence brought news of a letter from Khrushchev. It sounded human, emotional, rambling. A man's voice, not a committee's. The Soviet premier wrote about fear, about how he did not want war, about how Cuba had been meant as a way to redress the imbalance created by American missiles in Turkey and Italy, pointed at Soviet cities. He made an offer, buried in paragraphs of Cold War rhetoric. Remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public American pledge never to invade the island. No Berlin, no Turkey, just Cuba for no invasion. Kennedy read it carefully. Here, finally, was a ladder. Not a pretty one, not a sturdy one, but a way down from the ledge. They spent hours around the table, dissecting the letter. "We can work with this," Bobby said. "A no-invasion pledge costs us nothing we really want. We've already decided we're not going to invade again after Bay of Pigs." McNamara nodded. "It gives Khrushchev something he can sell domestically as a win," he said. "He takes his missiles home. He tells his people he stopped American aggression." The chiefs were less enthusiastic. "You're telling me we let him sneak missiles in, and his punishment is, we promise not to punish him if he takes them out?" one of them said. But before they could even settle on a response, a second message arrived from Moscow. Harder, colder, clearly written with help. Now, Khrushchev was demanding not just a no-invasion pledge, but the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Publicly. The temperature in the room dropped. The first letter had sounded like a nervous man reaching for a compromise. The second sounded like a bargaining committee, remembering every grievance of the last decade and stapling it to the deal. "If we accept this," Atchison said, "we reward blackmail. The entire alliance will wonder if we will trade their security when the pressure is on. Next time, it won't be Turkey. It will be Berlin." Kennedy felt the trap. If he accepted the public Turkey trade, NATO might crack. If he rejected the offer entirely, the crisis might spin out of control. They were balancing on the edge of two catastrophes at once: World War or the collapse of the Western Alliance. And then the day got worse. A U-2 reconnaissance plane, flying over Cuba, failed to return. In the cramped, crowded operations room, someone handed a slip of paper to McNamara. He read it, went pale, and passed it to the president. "Kennedy, John F. Major, Rudolph Anderson, USAF U-2, downed over Cuba. Surface-to-air missile. Kia." Kennedy stared at the words. The first blood of the crisis was American. For LeMay and the chiefs, it was like a dam had broken. "That's it," one of them said. "That's an act of war. They fired on our plane. We have to hit those SAM sites now." LeMay's voice was almost eager. "Mr. President, we should knock the hell out of them," he said. "They fired first. This takes the Pearl Harbor issue off the table. We're justified. We go in, wipe out their air defenses, then proceed with the strikes on the missiles. In his mind, the moral argument that had frustrated the civilians all week was gone. The Cubans, or the Soviets, had drawn first blood. Kennedy felt something else. He felt the moment when a gunfight in a crowded bar turns from shoving to the first broken bottle. Once the first man bleeds, everyone with a weapon finds a reason to use it. He closed his eyes for a second. He saw Major Anderson's face. Young, crew cut, wife at home, kids maybe. He knew there was a temptation in that moment to show toughness by matching blood for blood. To show his own generals that he was not afraid, that he could hit back. He also knew that if he ordered a strike now, the odds of this staying limited dropped to near zero. He opened his eyes. "We are not going to war over a plane," he said. LeMay stared at him, incredulous. "Sir, with all due respect, they've killed an American pilot in international airspace. If we don't respond, they'll think they can get away with anything." "They already think we're crazy enough to blow up the world," Kennedy shot back. "That's the only thing keeping them from firing. I'm not trading Miami for a SAM site." He felt the chief's anger like heat rolling down the table. In that moment, he wasn't just refusing to avenge a dead airman. He was announcing that he would rather look weak in front of his own generals than give them the war they were almost begging for. If you had put a microphone on LeMay's thoughts right then, they would not have been polite. This man is going to lose. This man is going to throw away the chance to solve this. This man is afraid. That night, the crisis moved from the cabinet room to a quiet office in the Justice Department. Robert Kennedy sat across from Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, in a room lit by a single lamp. The official channels were clogged with rhetoric. The public letters had started to contradict each other. So the two men, who spoke for the two men with their fingers on the nuclear trigger, sat face to face. Bobby Kennedy did not sugarcoat it. "We are extremely close to war," he said. "My brother is under enormous pressure to attack those missiles. He will not be able to hold off the military much longer." Dobrynin's face was grave. In Moscow, Khrushchev was under his own pressures. Hawks in the Presidium, hardliners in the military, Cubans who felt abandoned. Bobby made an offer. Publicly, the United States would accept Khrushchev's terms from the first letter. No invasion of Cuba in exchange for removal of Soviet missiles. Privately, quietly, the United States would agree to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy within a few months. No public link. No written promise. Just a gentleman's understanding, backed by the credibility of fear. Dobrynin listened. He understood what was being offered. On paper, it let both sides walk away with something. Khrushchev could say, "We defended Cuba, forced the Americans to promise not to invade. We placed missiles and removed them as equals." Kennedy could say, "We stared them down, forced them to back off." Nobody would talk loudly about Turkey. It was a bargain built out of lies, half-truths, and desperate pragmatism. It was also probably the only way to stop men in uniforms from getting what they thought they wanted. Bobby went back to the White House that night and told his brother what he had done. Kennedy nodded. The Jupiter missiles were, in truth, militarily obsolete. Slow, vulnerable, sitting in exposed above-ground launchers that the Soviets could destroy early in any war. Their real purpose was psychological, a symbol to reassure Turkey that America's nuclear umbrella was real. He knew telling the chiefs, and the Turks, that he was trading away those missiles under pressure would be explosive. so he didn't. He told almost no one. He took the weight of that secret, the way he had taken the weight of everything else that week, alone, in the end. October 28th. In the morning, a new message arrived from Moscow. Short, clear. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba under UN supervision in exchange for an American pledge not to invade and assurances about Turkey that were never spelled out in public. "We have decided to dismantle the weapons which you describe as offensive," he wrote, "and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union." It was, in the dry language of diplomacy, a climb down. The man who had rolled the dice by putting missiles in Cuba had realized, belatedly, that the table they were playing on was the planet. Kennedy read the message in silence. He felt something more complex than victory. Relief edged with anger. Anger at Khrushchev for putting the missiles there. Anger at his own military for almost shoving him into a war he believed would have killed tens of millions. Anger at the fact that he could never tell the public how close they had come, or exactly how they had gotten out. Around him, his advisors exhaled. McNamara actually slumped in his chair. "We're out of it," he said, almost to himself. "My God, we're still alive." The Joint Chiefs reacted differently. They saw the outcome through the narrow slot of their own expectations. No airstrikes, no invasion. The missiles removed on a deal. LeMay's verdict was blunt. "We've been had," he told colleagues. "We lost. The Russians throw some missiles into Cuba, and we pull back our Jupiters? We should have just gone in and finished the job." In his mind, the crisis had ended in defeat. He could not see the cities that were still standing as a kind of victory. Kennedy listened to reports of dismantling, of Soviet ships carrying missiles back across the Atlantic under the eyes of American reconnaissance planes. He did not crow. He did not go on television and say, "I stared them down." He gave measured statements. He spoke of a satisfactory resolution. He tried, desperately, not to humiliate Khrushchev in public, because he knew that men who felt humiliated with nuclear arsenals at their fingertips were bad bets for future crises. In private, he called his father. The old man, Joe Kennedy, had wanted his son to be tough, decisive, ruthless, if necessary. He had admired men who hit hard. That night, after the immediate danger had passed, John Kennedy said something his father did not expect. "I think they'll remember this," he said, "not for what we did, but for what we didn't do." Years later, when the tapes of the EXCOMM meetings were declassified, people finally got to hear what had really been said behind closed doors. They heard the President of the United States being told, to his face, that he was on the verge of another Munich. They heard a four-star general tell him he was in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President, as if the commander-in-chief were a schoolboy who had failed a test. They heard the president, in turn, say things no heroic poster ever shows. "I am afraid," he admitted to his brother. "Anybody who isn't is insane." The myth says leaders are fearless. The tapes said the opposite. The only sane man at that table was the one who understood exactly how much there was to fear. Historians later learned details nobody in the White House had known in 1962. A Soviet submarine near the quarantine line, B-59, had almost fired a nuclear torpedo when its crew thought war had broken out. Only a single officer's refusal stopped it. Soviet tactical nuclear weapons were on Cuba, under loose control, ready to be used against an American invasion force, which the chiefs had spent days urging. The margin between crisis and extinction had been thinner than even Kennedy imagined. The argument between him and Curtis LeMay stopped being an abstract policy disagreement. It became something far uglier. One man wanted to test his theory of victory in a world where the penalty for being wrong was the end of everything. The other refused. LeMay died, convinced that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been a missed opportunity, a show of weakness. Kennedy did not live long enough to see his image as one of the few leaders in history who had stared into the nuclear abyss and stepped back. Oswald's bullets took him in Dallas a year later, but the record of those 13 days remained. In them, you can hear something rare, not a big speech, not a stirring slogan. You hear a man fighting, not against a foreign enemy, though Khrushchev was real enough, but against his own side's deepest instincts, the hunger to strike, to destroy, to win, even when winning meant there might be nobody left to tell the story. The real betrayal in the Cuban Missile Crisis was not that John F. Kennedy refused to follow his generals over the cliff. It would have been if he had. He betrayed their expectations to keep faith with something larger than any war, the survival of the world they were all sworn to defend. In the end, his greatest order was the one he never gave. And for once in human history, not giving that order was what saved us.